how do you get better at positional chess? Today let me share with you the top 10 most important, most fundamental chess principles that are gonna get you to 1500 ratings and above. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, let's go ahead and get started. Here's the first position, it is white to move, and think about this for a second. How would you play here if you were white? Now black has just moved pawn e5, therefore obviously this knight on d4 is attacked and it needs to go. So where do you wish to put it? Most players in such positions would simply retreat somewhere to b3 or f3. And although it's okay, it's certainly better than blundering a knight, however, it's not ideal. And here's the first principle. You gotta get your knights to outposts. Now, what is an outpost? It is an advanced position into your opponent's side of the board where the knight cannot be chased away easily. Therefore, for your knights, ideally speaking, you would love for this knight to be brought right there on f5 and for this knight to be brought right here on d5. Now, which does not mean that you can play those moves straight away, but ideally you want to aim for those positions. Now, why is that so? Why do we wish our knight to stand here and not somewhere here? Well, here's the thing. A knight is a short-range piece, and therefore, if you keep the knight somewhere there, it does not attack your opponent in any way. It maybe guards some squares, but it certainly does not attack anything. It's not the case with your bishops that can be active at a long distance. However, for your knight, it needs to be right there, right into your opponent's side of the board. Therefore, if you could move your knight to f5 and fix it there so that it's not easy for your opponent to get away from this, that would actually be quite unpleasant, because from here the knight would attack a lot in your opponent's position, making it a real stallion that's going to harass your opponent long term. Now, the goal though is to make it not easy for black to get rid of this knight, because if you jump there straight away, it's not bad to do that, but he can just trade it off and eliminate the problem this way. So what do you do to actually make it harder for black to trade this way? Well, you can make this in-between check, bishop b5. Now they gotta cover their king somehow, let's say by the bishop, and now you can trade it off, which will make it impossible for them to take your knight on f5 in the future, and now you're free to go there. Now we have this brilliant knight, it already attacks this pawn on d6, and black is already feeling this pressure. Let's say if they wish to guard this pawn on d6 by going here, now you can utilize the same idea once again. Now, you'd wish to bring this knight to d5, however it's guarded by their counterpart on f6. What do you do to neutralize this defender? You can bring your bishop out there, pin the knight, neutralize it this way, and then you'll be free to go knight d5 in the future. So let's say if they play whatever, you can trade, play knight to d5, and now you can already feel how unpleasant black's position became because your knights are attacking everything around and black needs to be extremely careful to defend this position. Which brings us to the second principle, secure a good knight. If you see that you've got a knight already standing on a good position, putting pressure onto your opponent, controlling a whole lot of squares, however, your opponent can chase it away by going pawn g4, you gotta stop that. And you can't stop that by going pawn h5. In this case, it's going to be extremely difficult for white to do anything about this knight. It's going to stay there long term, put pressure, force your opponent to always defend this pawn on d4, and generally speaking, it certainly restricts white's movement. Now, if instead of h5, imagine black just played a more casual developing move, bishop e7, white would immediately play g4, kick this knight away, right to the edge of the board, and from here, the knight is in prison, it's doing nothing, and it's very hard for black to activate it. The beauty of all these patterns is that these are universal rules that apply to a wide range of positions. For example, right here in the King's Indian defense, it's a very common situations where black can land their knight to this strong square c5, attack this pawn on e4, currently it's attacked twice, white needs to guard it somehow, and after this we know that once we have a good knight, we want to secure its position. White wants to play b4 and chase the knight away, therefore we want to stop this by going pawn a5 ourselves. This way it's going to be much harder for white to ever play b4, or they'll have to spend a ton of time preparing that advancement, and now your knight is attacking this pawn, is pressuring all these squares, making it harder for white to move. By the way, there is another common error for white. If they try to prepare b4 by going pawn a3, kind of preparing b4 somewhere in the future, that is actually a big positional error, because now black can push this pawn one square forward, taking complete control of this square b3, making it virtually impossible for white to ever get their pawn to b4, because you'll always be able to capture it en passant, and in this case, white is really in trouble. The third pattern is indeed golden. If you just get this one pattern out of this video, you'll be ahead of the crowd straight away. Now, in this position, it is black to play. Let me ask you a question. What do you think about black trading his bishop for a knight? It is actually the most played move in the position. And from the eyes of most players, it is just an equal exchange. Bishop is approximately equal to a knight, so why not to trade it? But in reality, the rule is to take is a mistake, which means that you should avoid unprovoked, unmotivated exchanges that do not bring you any particular, very specific advantages that you can comprehend. Now, in this case, bishop takes c3 is not forced. This bishop is not attacked, right? And nothing really pushes black into this trade. They do this voluntarily. And as they do this exchange, let's see what changed in the position. First off, white got this easy opportunity to bring his bishop to this extremely active diagonal. Moreover, if black doesn't castle straight away, bishop a3 might be a big problem for them. In addition to that, white got this new semi-open file for his rook. Again, previously, think about this. Before the trade, how could white possibly activate this rook? There's no easy way. It would take a long time. But after black traded, rook b1 is very simple and natural in the next move, and the rook is active straight away. Also, now this pawn on c3 strengthens the center. Therefore, if black ever tries to undermine it, white doesn't have to worry. The center is already super strong. White also got these two bishops advantage because in reality a bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight, and therefore in general white got this 1, 2, 3 advantages for nothing. Black got nothing from this exchange. Therefore, again, to take is a mistake. Only capture something when it's provoked, when there is some specific reason to why you need to do that to avoid losing something or to gain certain specific advantage. The fourth principle is not very well known, but in fact is extremely powerful. It says, blockade his central pawns to hinder his development. Here's what it means. Usually, in order to develop his minor pieces, he needs to push his e-pawn and his d-pawn forward. However, if there is a way for you to blockade them, such as in this case, you can sacrifice a pawn to achieve this goal, and after this trade, it becomes so clumsy and so hard for black to do anything to untangle their pieces. Just imagine this. Let's say they want to bring their knight back. Okay, but what are they going to do next after this? Like, they can't easily develop this bishop. If they bring the knight to d7, like, it's going to block everything else around. How can they develop this bishop? They can't easily move the e-pawn forward. And if they can't bring out their minor pieces, it means that they can't bring their heavy pieces into play just as well. Therefore, it just becomes their position so cramped and so hard to activate that it's definitely worth one little pawn. And in this particular position, if instead of, let's say, take this move back, if black tries to, trade off one of his double pawns straight away, that would actually fail to queen h5. His position is so clumsy that you can even get to this really spectacular, flashy bishop checkmate. Now this is the next example. It is white to move once again. Think about this for a second. How do you play here if you're white? Just to be clear, the pawn moves that way. Well, white is up a pawn on endgame. Definitely they wish to potentially push it forward and promote it. However, if you just try to push your pawn forward, black would bring their knight into play, and on the next move they could bring it somewhere here, later on trade it off for this pawn and achieve a draw. The fifth pattern explains that you can restrict your opponent's knight by putting your piece or a pawn 2 squares away from a knight. And it works for every piece or a pawn except the rook, because the rook cannot shoot diagonally and take control of these squares. But if you can use any other piece, a bishop, a king, a queen, a pawn, like, it works. It restricts the knight. In this case, black can't bring their knight back into play without being traded off, and it means that white will win this game easily by just pushing his passed pawn forward. And it's not just an endgame pattern, it works across any other phase of the game just as well. Here it is white to move, and the best thing white can do is to play pawn b4. This time we're using a pawn 2 squares away from a knight to restrict it, and again it's going to be extremely hard for black to activate this knight. And this one little pawn move actually turns this into a winning position for white, just because it's very hard for black to make use of their knight anyhow in this game. By the way, if they try to reroute the knight here, it's going to be the same thing. I'm not saying right now, but let's just fantasize about this. Like, from here, it also can't move forward because of the other pawn that stands 2 squares away. Now, therefore, b4 just makes it really hard for black to kind of use the knight, and so you're kind of up a piece in this position, and you're probably going to play queen d3, attack this pawn, and win the game. So this little pawn move can make a big difference, because imagine this pawn is not there. Black would just bring their knight to c5, and the game is equal. The pattern number 6 states that a bishop is stronger than a knight. There is a common fallacy that these are equally valuable pieces, but it's not exactly true. A bishop can control greater quantity of squares on the board than a knight, and that is how we determine which piece is stronger. In such positions like this, very often black players think to themselves, well, the easiest way to solve a problem of this bishop so that I don't have to worry about where to move it is just to trade it off. But that is actually quite a big positional error. Now after queen takes, we're threatening this pawn on f7 and they can just cover it. For the moment, it feels like there is nothing bad with black. However, now there's a long-term problem. All the light squares in their position are going to be weak permanently for lack of light squared bishop. And you can take advantage of this right away if you understand this idea. White can start targeting those white squares by going queen b3, and that is actually a double attack to this pawn as well as to this pawn. And notice that they both are on light squares, and white basically is winning the game on the spot. Let's say black tries to guard this pawn by going something like queen to d7, then we capture this light square pawn and we attack the rook. If he tries to cover that, you could infiltrate with queen c8, another light square, but it's even stronger to play bishop b5. And this time we're pinning the queen, winning it, the rook is still attacked, queen c8 is still possible on some lines. And notice that all these threats that black is experiencing right now are occurring on light squares for lack of their light squared bishop. Thus, if someone wishes you a good knight, tell them you prefer a good bishop. In the next example, it is white to move, and white certainly needs to complete their development. Now, where would you develop this bishop from f1? You can put it to any square you want to. Therefore, which one do you choose? Here's the principle. Move your pieces to the most forward available square. In such positions, most players would end up playing bishop e2 just to neutralize this pin. However, this is the most passive position of the bishop. It does not attack your opponent, it does not put pressure onto your opponent at all. Also, it makes your own position a little clumsy, because if your opponent castles queenside, now your queen is kind of x-rayed by the rook, but the queen has no way out. It is restricted by his own pieces, and if white lightheartedly castles, he can fall into this discovered attack straight away and lose the game. Compare this with putting your piece to the most forward available square, which is bishop b5. This time, we are putting pressure. Their knight is pinned. If they try casting, we can actually trade right there and expose their king. If we need to move our queen away from danger, we can always play queen e2, and from here, we're going to have different threats, and we're totally safe. Now, white's position is absolutely great. The final three patterns are mostly applicable to an endgame phase, even though they are universal and you can use them anywhere. Now, white has just played f4, attacking your opponent e5. What would you play here if you're black? Most players would just trade off the pawn because it feels like the easiest solution. But after this, guess what? Actually, that is a losing error. There is a reason why there is two exclamation marks here. It is a losing blunder. After this trade, white is now free to advance his king, and if we imagine the outcome, it's going to be quite sad for black. In the future, white is going to move his king here, grab the pawn, and promote his passed pawn. Black is done. Black lost the game because they were unaware of the pattern number 8, called a knight barrier. Your knight controls squares of one color only. In this example, these are light squares. And it actually does a pretty good job controlling a whole lot of them. However, it does not control at all those dark squares. And therefore, you need to control those remaining squares with some other piece, and usually a pawn is even better. Just think about this. Right now, the white king cannot advance forward at all. It cannot go to light squares because of your knight, and it cannot go to dark squares because of your pawns. Therefore, you have this perfect barrier. Your opponent just can't enter at all. All these squares are under your control. Therefore, your opponent cannot do anything. And black just need to maintain this situation by playing pawn f6. And after this, that's it. There is nothing white can do. Really nothing, and it's just a draw. There's rumor that in order to play like Magnus Carlsen, you need to increase your intake of magnesium and calcium. However, you can get there by utilizing the pattern number 9, which says that you can make your opponent's bishop useless by putting your pawns and pieces on the opposite color. In this case, we've got a light square bishop for white, and therefore if you're playing black, you wish to put your pawns and pieces, as much as possible, to dark squares. Therefore, you can start by repositioning your light square pawns to dark squares. You can go g5, simultaneously we prevent white from pushing forward. And now what can white do? Like, not much really, so let's say they just wait. And you can keep doing the same thing. Now we reposition this light square pawn to a dark square, and after a couple more moves we can do the same with these pending pawns, c5. The bishop, by the way, can't go too much further away because we can actually sack the bishop right here. and promote our pass pawn. Therefore, the bishop needs to stay there and guard it. And then you can also do the same with the pending pawn on h5. Let's say they wait, you push the pawn forward to h4, and now we achieve that ideal setup, where this bishop is totally useless for the rest of the game. It can never cause any trouble to you. While for white, it is the opposite situation. Like, their pawns are always vulnerable to your attack. Like, they always have to worry about these pawns, plus you can potentially reroute your bishop somewhere there. Not there. I meant to f1. Something is wrong with my arrows. You got the point. Somewhere here, and attack his pawn on g2. Alright? So let's get away with just one arrow. Now, the other advantage of putting your pawns to dark squares is that we fix his pawns on light squares, and now they restrict his own bishop. He can't really move. And this makes your position just winning. Now, at this point, once you're totally dominant, you can rush into the attack, c4, and after the trade, now notice we attack this pawn, and we threaten to go there and attack this pawn, and white cannot attack anything. That's that ideal outcome that we wanted, and that's how you win the game. In the next example, it is white to move, and you need to decide how to move these pawns to prevent this back rank checkmate. What would you play here as white? There is a rule here that a connected pawn chain is the strongest, and in this position, this is what can help white to achieve a draw. Now, think about this. What if white played this move pawn to h3, just creating this escape square similar to middle game positions? Now, in this case, the downside is that he can keep attacking you and harassing you. He can attack the king, he can keep attacking these pawns, and although you can't defend it, it still feels unpleasant. Instead, the best pawn structure white should aim for is playing g3 followed by h4, and that is that pawn structure that has proven to be best by test. Now, first of all, your king is now totally safe. Your opponent can deliver this pawn check, but it doesn't make a big difference. You just move forward, and that is it. There is nothing that this rook can attack any longer, therefore that check doesn't make much sense. On the next move after black plays whatever, you can play h4, and now you got this ideal connected pawn chain, where pawns support each other. Like, this pawn is guarded, this pawn is guarded, therefore you only have one weakness, but not three of them. And it could be useful sometimes, because previously, when you had all your pawns standing on the second rank, right here, the rook attacks and indirectly puts pressure to all of them. While when you move them away, now the rook only can take one pawn at a time. Well, the rook can always take only one pawn at a time, but I mean, it cannot indirectly put pressure to many of them. And it could be useful. Let's say he tries pushing the pawn forward, and you advance your king, right? At some point, he can't so easily push the pawn forward because it's controlled by your rook, and let's say he tries to do the same. You can even play king e4, let's say just to restrict his king to control of all these squares. And black can't make any progress here. At some point they'll probably have to capture this pawn on f2, but again, from here it no longer attacks those pawns that used to be on the second rank, and now you can capture his pawn, and it is a theoretical draw. Today we talked about some helpful tips, and if you wish to know my complete blueprint for chess improvement, as well as to know how to incorporate this in your games so that you actually follow them, you can check it out in my course, Level Up Your Chess. You can get access to it by clicking the link down below in the description, and you'll have me helping you all along the way. If you're interested, again, you can check this out and see if you like it. Either way, have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.